Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into today's episode of Canal Days, what life was like in the industrial Connecticut River Valley. And as always, I'm your host Carrie, along with my co-host, founder of Historical Tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Camus. Our Canal Days series explores the historic sites throughout Massachusetts, and with Robert's expertise of the history as your personal tour guide. Each episode we discover a new location with hidden history within. Today's episode will be exploring the Quabbin Park Cemetery, located in Ware, Massachusetts. So, where is the Quabbin Park Cemetery located?
It's off of Route 9 on the Belchtown to Ware Highway, put in the same time the cemetery was put in, about 1932, to keep traffic going on the east-west axis by the Quabbin area. And the entrance is very easy to find, beautiful entrance gate, and the whole cemetery is absolutely gorgeous. And they added a lot of cool features in here that we're going to talk about at some point. Including, I'm going to tell you who the first two burials are. Now, you can include going to Quabbin Reservoir and seeing a lot of its special features, its dams, its spillways, its tower and picnic area and visitor center. You can include a dam hike, and you can include hikes into the wilderness and Dana, and you can just drive around the whole Quabbin. But you should always include a visit to the cemetery, because this is a history of the displaced communities, four of them: Enfield, Dana, Greenwich, and Prescott.
And can you describe why the Quabbin Park Cemetery was made?
It was made to relocate the graves from the many cemeteries of the Quabbin area. Dana Cemetery, Greenwich, Prescott, and Enfield Cemetery, but also all the smaller family cemeteries that were located on those bits of lands that were displaced. And there were many. There was, sure, the four major ones, each community, but there was another maybe 30 small family cemeteries, as small as just 4 burials, as small as 8, 10, 20, 30, right? Depends upon how long that family was in the community. And then they reburied them. They didn't rebury them by the cemeteries that took them by necessarily. Or, there could be a Dana section next to the Enfield section, next to the Greenwich section. There was no order by community as they put them into the cemetery itself.
Back to Canal Days and our Quabbin Park Cemetery episode. And so, what are the features within the Quabbin Park Cemetery?
When they moved the town centers of these 4 communities, they brought along with it the statues, memorial plaques, kins, anything symbolic of the community, and put them into the Quabbin Park Cemetery. So the center of Dana had implements, and they brought those and put them somewhat together and angled them so that it looks very nice. The same was done for Enfield, which was the biggest community. They brought anything from the central commons of Enfield and put it into the cemetery, because there's nowhere else to go with it. And they did the same for Greenwich and for Prescott, to make it look like these locations never disappeared. Right, so you can go through there and see the beautiful implements. There's also a chapel, which actually is an office, but it looks like a chapel, so you can always treat it as such. There's a beautiful mausoleum. There's many, many memorial plaques around the area, so when you walk around, you can read all the plaques that are put up by the Quabbin district in order to honor what was being done in this area. There's also a tomb put up in the first year, 1932, and its wintertime capacity is 8. The chapel is from 1940, and to give you an example specifically, Enfield has a Civil War statue. It's World War I honor roll and memorial. And within the cemetery, you're going to find the cemetery maps and, of course, the plaques I mentioned. The landscape architect in charge was a man named Arthur Shircliffe, and he designed this beautiful cemetery to look like a garden style cemetery or a rural style cemetery. It's a memorial place, and by this time of history, sure, the first garden style cemetery in the United States was 1832. This was 100 years later. By then, they were calling cemeteries in this style a newer name, and that was a park. And so they called this Quabbin Park Cemetery. And so there's a lot for you to see around this area.
And can you disclose the names of some of the previous cemeteries that had been moved and possibly analyze why and what caused their relocation?
Okay, now, sure, most of the cemeteries that were moved were in the location of where the reservoir would be. So they had to be moved. And so Enfield Cemetery is right where the Quabbin Reservoir would be. And Sarah Prescott, in one case, the Dana Cemetery, they moved it even without needing to, because it's not where the reservoir would be. But in the case of Dana, it was in the watershed. The water was going to pass by this area and end up in the Quabbin Reservoir. So you don't want deceased burials to be in a place where there's a lot of water flowing by in the direction of the reservoir, because that will end up into the reservoir itself. So they moved the Dana Cemetery without it being in the exact location, but for a very good reason, because it was upstream of the Swift River, and water would have brought into either the Swift River or into the Quabbin itself. Now, there's a lot of small cemeteries around, some under family names, other under other names, like the Blue Ridge Cemetery that was in Enfield. It's now part of, I believe, Belchtown. There was even cemeteries in Pelham, one cemetery or two cemeteries in Pelham that had to be moved because they were on the downside of a ridge, and the burials, the particles coming out of the burials would have ended up in the Swift River or into the Quabbin itself.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's episode of Canal Days. As always, I'm your host, Carrie, along with my co-host, founder of Historical Tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Kumo. Our Canal Days series delves into the vast collection of historical sites throughout Massachusetts with Robert's expertise of the local history as our personal guide. Each episode, we uncover history throughout local communities, highlighting the historic landmarks and uncovering their seminal significance. Today's episode of Canal Days will be introducing the Quabbin Park Cemetery and explaining some of its history. So, old cemeteries were originally on the land of the Quabbin, where the Quabbin was made. So, can you reveal which cemeteries were relocated in order to create the Quabbin?
A lot of them. My goodness, about 27 of them were moved around out of their location, and for various reasons. Some would have been underneath the Quabbin's water, some would have been in the watershed of the Quabbin Reservoir, and you don't want these things to happen because, of course, your organic molecules from the decay could get into the water in either type of situations. So, what you want is not to have the cemeteries there. So, in this cemetery are reinterments from the following named and other smaller cemeteries: from Belchtown, Blue Meadow, from Dana, Browns, Williams, Richardson, Dana Center, Town, Pine Grove, Hopkins, Old, North Dana, and Stone. In Enfield, Woodlawn, Church, Packardsville, Cemetery Hill. In Greenwich, the Greenwich Cemetery. In New Salem, the Golden Lake Cemetery. In Petersham, the Snow Cemetery. In Prescott, the Townhouse, the Fish House, the Isaac Lindsay, Jason Powers, Pine Grove, and Pelham Hollow. And interestingly enough, some of those cemeteries used to be in other communities 300 years ago, and then when they started getting towns breaking off other communities, you have them in the cemetery would be in the location of that new town that formed. And this is not a complete list, there's other cemeteries. So my website, I've acquired the other names and I'm starting to put them into list forms for you. Notice how many communities there are. There's on that not only the 4 towns that were taken out, Enfield, Dana, Greenwich, and Prescott, but also there's Petersham, New Salem, and Belchtown. New Salem and Petersham lost one cemetery each because they were in the watershed, not that they would have been underwater. Dana lost a lot of cemeteries not because they would have been underwater, but it was definitely in the watershed. Others would have been underwater, and so they had to be taken out. Right? Even Belchtown lost one called the Blue Meadow, but it gained a lot of geographic area. It actually gained at least one more cemetery by the rearrangement of the land. So what a list, and it was quite the project to say the least.
And disclose who designed the new Quabbin Park Cemetery.
Alright, why do you need a designer of a cemetery? Of course you need a design, especially when it's a park-style cemetery. That means it was designed in the look of a park. It was designed actually after the one in Cambridge called the Mount Auburn Cemetery. And so it has curving paths, terrain that goes up and down, and it has lots of trees around on it. It has lots of bushes and flowers and memorials and chapel. Arthur Shercliffe was the landscape designer. And I don't think he's buried here, but he did a fine job. And so this is a great testament of how well planned the Quabbin Reservoir area was planned out. Has never had problems with his dam and his water delivery systems. It had to take 4 towns out, but it did a great job of making this cemetery.
And detail the layout of how the burials were relocated into the new Quabbin Park Cemetery.
Right, there is no arrangement. So when the bodies came in on a given day, they would have holes prepared for them, and they would be put into the ground. The original coffin, of course the body, the headstone would be brought. Any other headstones that were secondary when a person's name that already had a name on another headstone was just discarded. And also every coffin had at least one shovelful of dirt placed on the very top of the coffin, not inside but on the very top of the wood. That means that was a symbolic way to say that you're not being removed from the soil that you were in, you'll be still put in with it. And so that was very nice. But only families were kept together. Cemeteries were not kept together. Towns were not kept together. And so thus when you go there, there is a lot of rhyme and reason in terms of the burials, but they were not put together by towns or by cemetery at all. So keep that in mind. It's very deceptive. You would think that Enfield had its a particular cemetery put to your purpose. No. When they were dug up on a given day, they would arrive on truck and to be buried according to the arrival. Only family plots where the names were all together were kept together.
And chronicle the year of the first burial placed within the cemetery.
That happened in the year 1932. It was 2 women that were not part of the movement of the cemeteries into the Quabbin Park cemeteries. They were people that died and had lived their lives in one of those 4 disincorporated communities and would be buried in the cemetery, because if you lived in the Quabbin area and were removed, then you had the right to be buried in the Quabbin Memorial Cemetery. If you had ancestors that lived in these cemeteries. Then you had the right to be placed inside there. If you were one of the workers associated with the cemetery, you had that right also. So the first burial was June 11th, a burial of Mary Hart, 76, a native of Dana and a resident of North Dana, who died at the Man Memorial Hospital in Ethel. Then after her, on June 21st, same year, 10 days later, the body of Mrs. Frances Chamberlain Eddy, wife of John Eddy, was brought to this park. She was the second burial ever here. She died in her house in Orange. She had been displaced. Okay, now she actually died much earlier. She died on February 7th of 1932, but her body had been held in a holding tomb in Orange until June. So she was the second burial, but the first person to die that would be buried in the Quabbin Cemetery. Now, all those disinterments and reinterments were started happening, but the first two were for very different reasons.
Be fascinated by local history and eager to investigate the obscure treasures off the beaten path throughout the state of Massachusetts, or maybe just seeking an unforgettable cultural activity for family and friends to enjoy, look no further than Historical Tours of Greater Holyoke, founded by Robert Camus. With over a decade of experience, Robert offers captivating tours and presentations of historic sites and landmarks throughout the state. Whether you're interested in canals, cemeteries, charming churches, or more, Robert's tours provide a unique and enriching experience for all. And that's not it. You can also schedule private tours tailored to your interests, ensuring a personalized adventure and unforgettable memories. Perfect for families or groups of all sizes, making for an exciting hands-on learning experience that brings history to life. Simply visit holyokecanaltour.org or email bobcat4214B@yahoo.com to book your private tour today. So, getting back to our episode on the Quabbin Park Cemetery, familiarize us with the cemetery's chapel.
Yes, like any good garden-style cemetery or park cemetery, it'll have a nice chapel, and this Quabbin one does. It has many nice features throughout it, but that beautiful chapel was made in the classical revival style, and has a plaque on the front of it that tells you an honor roll of the men who went off to World War I. And honor rolls every person that was involved in the war. When they have a star next to their names, those men are the ones that died because of that war, either injury or illnesses. Such as in Dana, you had Ryan and Hunter. Enfield, you have Newitt, Plant and Plant. They might be two brothers there. In Greenwich, you had Walker. In Prescott, you have Courier, Lincoln, and Shaw. So that's about 10 names. So those are the people from the Quabbin that died in the course of World War I. That would be the last war that people from the Quabbin would be directly involved in, because during the 30s they were and moved out. But I'm sure plenty of former residents fought also in World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, and the war in Iraq. So there could be further memorials coming in.
And inform us on the tomb within the cemetery.
A holding tomb is a place where during the January, February, and March, that is the winter months, the ground is too hard, and so you couldn't dig it. Now, it wasn't used very much after 1940 when the reservoir was ready, because they had equipment that could heat up the top foot of the soil, and underneath there had been soft enough to dig out with machinery. So this holding tomb really was made differently for all other holding tombs around Massachusetts. It was made to hold bodies that came in, and they couldn't bury them that day within the Quabbin Park Cemetery. But they keep who they were, keep note of it with their stone and with the soil, and they would bury them hopefully the next day or on Monday, on weekends. So it was mostly, surprisingly, to all people that had already been buried and were disinterred and would be reinterred. That's very different from most Holden tombs.
And describe the memorial section for us.
The memorial is a great section. It's a section you first see once you go up the entranceway. You'll see inside of it memorial stones, plaques, and this is the part that most people consider one of the prettiest. And for instance, you'll see past the Holden tomb, the chapel to the right, and then you see a Civil War statue from Enfield where the names of all men involved in the Civil War have been put onto it. All right, and this is not an honor roll. This is a death roll. So there's quite a few men in here because the Civil War killed a lot of people. So all these men died. All right, there's also a World War I honor roll within there. There is cannonballs, cannons themselves. There is a stone from Dana where it says Dana remembers and puts down all the deaths of people from Dana, Revolutionary War, War with England, Civil War, and World War I. There's also a memorial stone to Hosea Balu, who lived nearby. And there's actually in that area also a time capsule that will be opened in a few years. It was put into the ground in 1988. So there's a lot to look at. There's benches around the area. There's a lot of history to these wonderful roads. So drive down them or walk around and learn about some of the burials, look at some of the older stones, and try to imagine what they looked like back in the day.
And share which features throughout the Quabbin Park Cemetery you favor the most.
I like the memorial or the park style of any cemetery in that style, that garden look. I like that very much. But if I had to put down a feature, or a physical feature itself, I would put down that beautiful monument stone that is right in the very tip of the memorial section. It's a monument stone that honors the men from Enfield that went off to war and lost their lives for their country. It has all their names and 3 plaques around it, and a beautiful statue of a Union Army soldier on the very top of it. Quite a gorgeous entrance into a cemetery.
Can you inform our listeners on where they can find more information on the Quabbin Park Cemetery?
When these burials were moved, there was a process in the 1930s that at that cemetery they would take a picture of the gravestone, both front and back, and they did this before they moved the body in the stone, and then it was put into place. So you can actually see the look of these stones. Now, 5,000 of the 6,000 were put into the Quabbin Park Cemetery, so you're going to match them off there. 1,012 were not placed into Quabbin Park Cemetery. They were placed in other cemeteries around the United States. If an ancestor or descendant of a person wanted a burial to take place in another cemetery, they would have transport of the burial and the gravestone to that new cemetery. They would have a free burial religious service. The only thing they had to pay for was a new plot in that new cemetery. So that was a little bit of a fee. But most people like very much the Quabbin Park Cemetery. That's why 83% of the burials happen there. But those 1,000 others, where are they? Well, you can figure it out since Find a Grave is so strong nowadays. Those 1,012 burials, you can figure out if you put a lot of work into it by, if you know they're not in the Quabbin Cemetery, then put their name and hopefully their death date into the search engine of findagrave.com. And you'll find what cemetery they're placed into. If you know they're placed in a certain cemetery for sure, and you don't have a picture yet, you can find that picture on the state's website for the Quabbin Cemetery, and I hooked to my webpage, so you can actually reconstruct your ancestors' gravestone, even if you don't quite have it yet, if it's another cemetery somewhere around the country. And I've done that for a few. I found one big gravestone in Granby, for instance, that I know was transported, and one in South Hadley. And no, there's others around. I know that the Mount Hope Cemetery in Belchtown received a lot of these because a lot of people that left the Quabbin area went up to the surrounding towns of New Salem, Pelham, Belchtown, Ware, and Hardwick. And so look in those cemeteries to find them if you really have to. But this would be a great way to search for them if you know they went to other places. So thank you very much for listening.
And thanks for listening to Canal Days and our podcast on the Quabbin Park Cemetery, and joining us for our journey through the Connecticut River Valley. And we hope you enjoyed uncovering some of the hidden and overlooked marvels and their fascinating stories that shaped our past in the state of Massachusetts. A special thanks to Robert Camus, founder of Historical Tours of Greater Holyoke, for sharing his passion with us. Remember, you can find more information about Robert's tours, book private tours, and explore the Canal Days video and podcast series at holyokecanaltour.org.